Welcome. Before we step into this dark and disturbing story, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this take countless hours of digging through old records, forgotten testimonies, and hidden history to uncover the truth. Tonight's story isn't about a battlefield or a courtroom. It's about a man who spent his entire life feeding hounds, training them, living in their shadows, until one night, when hunger changed, loyalty broke, and something irreversible happened that no one was prepared for. He was born into the plantation system with no recorded name of his own, only a designation written in the ledger beside a single duty: kennel hand. From the time he was strong enough to carry a bucket, his world revolved around the hounds. They were not ordinary dogs. They were bred for tracking, trained to chase, to corner, to intimidate, and sometimes to tear apart whatever they were commanded to find. While others worked the fields or the house, he lived on the edge of the property near the kennels, where the smell of wet fur, raw meat, and iron, heavy blood never truly faded. This was his inheritance, passed to him without choice, without mercy. Every morning before sunrise, he rose to the sound of barking that echoed like a warning across the land. He cleaned the cages with bare hands, scraped filth from the floors, and patched wounds left from training sessions that were meant to harden the animals into weapons. He fed them scraps mixed with whatever meat could be spared, carefully portioned, always watched. The overseer made sure he understood one thing: clearly the hounds were worth more than him. If one went hungry, sick, or untrained, the punishment would be swift. And it was. Over the years, the dogs learned his scent before they learned obedience. They responded to his footsteps, his voice, his hands. He spoke to them quietly, not with commands, but with familiarity. Some nights, when the moon was high and the plantation slept, he sat near the kennels and listened to them breathe, matching his rhythm to theirs. It was the only place where he wasn't shouted at, whipped, or ignored. The hounds did not judge him by his chains. They only knew routine, hunger, and the sound of the man who brought their food. But that closeness was dangerous. The overseer warned him never to grow attached. They are tools, he was told, and tools don't love back. Still, it was impossible not to notice their individual traits. One limped from an old injury. Another refused to eat unless he stayed nearby. One, a large brindled male, would whine softly when the others grew aggressive, as if unsettled by violence. He remembered these details because remembering gave him a sense of control in a life that offered none. His role went beyond feeding. He helped train them to recognize fear. When enslaved people tried to escape, he was forced to assist, holding leashes, calming the dogs before release. He never led the chase, but he heard the screams carried back on the wind. Each time, something inside him hardened and fractured at the same time. The dogs came back bloodied, praised, rewarded with extra meat. He cleaned them in silence, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on the ground. The hounds wagged their tails, oblivious to the weight they carried into his soul. Years passed this way. Seasons changed, owners changed, but his task never did. He aged faster than he should have, his back bent, his hands scarred and thickened. Still, he was known as reliable. The dogs listened to him. They obeyed him. That fact alone kept him alive when others were sold, beaten, or disappeared. He was necessary, and necessity on a plantation was the closest thing to protection. Yet necessity is also a cage. He could not leave the kennels without permission. He slept close enough to hear the dogs stir at night, close enough to smell sickness before it showed. When food was short, he went hungry so the hounds wouldn't. When punishment was needed, it was often delivered in front of the kennels as a reminder of hierarchy. Man below dog, dog below master. That order was never spoken aloud, but everyone understood it. Despite everything, the hounds never attacked him. Even during their most frenzied training, they stopped short when he spoke. That fact unsettled the overseer. Power that wasn't commanded was dangerous. He was warned again and again to remember his place. But place is a fragile thing when survival depends on obedience and silence. By the time the story reaches its breaking point, he had spent nearly his entire life feeding hunger that was never meant to be satisfied. He knew exactly how much meat it took to keep the hounds calm. He knew what happened when that balance was disturbed. Hunger changed behavior. Hunger sharpened instincts. Hunger erased training. And that knowledge, earned over years of forced service, quiet observation, and suppressed rage, became the most dangerous thing he possessed. Because when a man understands hunger better than anyone else on the land, he also understands how to change it. The hounds were not raised like ordinary animals. From the moment they were weaned, they were shaped into instruments of fear. Their training began early, long before their teeth fully hardened, and it followed a pattern designed to erase instinct and replace it with obedience. Hunger was the first lesson. They were never fed until they learned to sit perfectly still, eyes locked forward, muscles tense. Food was not nourishment to them, it was reward, control, and survival. And the man who fed them was forced to become the hand that delivered all three. The dogs were chosen for size, aggression, and endurance. Bloodlines were kept carefully, almost reverently, because these animals were considered valuable property. They were trained to track by scent alone, taught to follow torn cloth, sweat-soaked rags, and footprints crushed into the dirt. The handler watched as overseers dragged those scents across fields and into the woods, tying them to posts, smearing them on trees. Then the hounds were released. When they succeeded, they were praised. When they hesitated, they were beaten. Fear was not a flaw in training, it was the goal. The man learned quickly that his role was not just to feed them, but to keep them balanced on the edge between restraint and savagery. Too much food made them sluggish. Too little made them unpredictable. Every meal was measured. Every scrap weighed against the next day's needs. He memorized their reactions the way another man might memorize prayers. The sound of a low growl before feeding meant tension. Refusal to eat meant sickness or stress. Sudden silence meant danger. He learned to read their bodies because his life depended on it. Training sessions were brutal and methodical. The dogs were taught to associate certain sounds with pursuit: a horn, a whistle, the crack of a whip. Once that sound rang out, restraint vanished. They lunged, strained at chains, claws digging into the dirt until blood mixed with soil. The handler stood nearby, holding leashes, calming them just enough to keep order. He spoke softly to them, not out of kindness, but necessity. His voice was the only thing that stood between discipline and chaos. What made the hounds truly feared was not just their strength, but their conditioning. They were trained to recognize panic. When someone ran, when breath shortened, and steps became erratic, the dogs responded instantly. The handler saw this again and again. He saw how quickly joy replaced tension, once the chase ended, how tails wagged even as men screamed. The dogs did not understand cruelty. They understood reward. Over time, stories spread across the plantation and beyond. People whispered about the kennel before they whispered about the house. Children were warned that if they strayed too far, the dogs would come. Adults lowered their voices when the hounds barked at night. Even overseers treated them with caution, never stepping too close to the cages. Everyone knew one thing: once the hounds were released, nothing human could outrun them. And yet, despite all this training, the dogs never turned on the man who fed them. That was what unsettled those in charge the most. He moved among them freely, stepped into their space, broke up fights with a firm word and a steady hand. The hounds obeyed him without the whip. They watched him when he entered, ears alert, tails low but calm. He was not their master, but he was something else. A constant, the source of hunger and relief. That closeness was dangerous. Training was meant to strip animals of loyalty, except to command. But the dogs had formed a bond that training could not erase. They knew his scent, his rhythm, the sound of his breathing in the dark. When storms came and thunder shook the kennels, it was his presence that kept them from tearing at each other. When one was injured, it was his hands that cleaned the wound. Over time, the dogs learned that he was safety. The irony was cruel. The very system designed to instill fear had created a weakness. By forcing one man to understand the hounds so completely, their hunger, their instincts, their limits, it had given him knowledge no overseer possessed. He knew what would make them obey. He also knew what would make them forget every command they had ever learned. And buried beneath years of routine, punishment, and silence, that knowledge waited. Because training built on hunger can always be undone by hunger. And the man who fed the hounds understood that better than anyone else on the plantation. Years passed, and with them came a kind of silence that settled deep inside him. From the outside, his life looked unchanged, the same kennels, the same routines, the same barking that split the mornings and haunted the nights. But inside, something was slowly being worn down. Silent obedience became his armor, because speaking invited punishment and resistance invited disappearance. He learned early that survival on the plantation did not belong to the loud or the brave. It belonged to those who endured without being seen. Cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it came in the form of deprivation, meals skipped, water withheld, sleep broken by whistles in the night, calling him back to the kennels. Other times it was deliberate humiliation. He was ordered to kneel while overseers inspected the hounds, criticized his work, and reminded him that if even one dog fell ill, his body would pay the price. Punishment was often carried out in front of the cages, as if to teach both man and beast their place in the hierarchy. The dogs watched with wide eyes and restless pacing as the whip fell. They learned pain. He learned endurance. He was never allowed to forget that his life was considered expendable. When new dogs arrived, fierce and untrained, he was forced to handle them first, a test. The overseer said, if he was bitten, it meant he had failed. If he survived, it meant the dog was worth keeping. Scars collected on his arms and hands, each one a reminder that his body existed as a buffer between violence and control. And yet, he returned to the kennels every morning, because there was nowhere else to go. Obedience became second nature. He moved when told, stopped when ordered, lowered his eyes, even when anger burned behind them. Years of silence taught him how to listen, not just to words, but to tone pauses and the shifting moods of those who held power. He learned when to disappear into the background and when to make himself useful. That usefulness saved him again and again, even as it trapped him deeper. But unseen cruelty carried a heavier weight. He witnessed things he could never speak of. He saw men dragged back in chains, bleeding and broken, while the hounds barked in excitement. He heard the screams echo through the trees during chases he was forced to support. At night, when the plantation slept, those sounds returned in his mind. He sat near the kennels, staring into the dark, listening to the dogs breathe, wondering how something so loyal could be shaped into something so cruel, and how he himself had been shaped the same way. There were moments, brief and dangerous, when anger threatened to surface. Once, after watching a young boy whipped for dropping a bucket, his hands shook so badly he spilled the dogs a feed. The overseer noticed. A warning followed, quiet, close, whispered into his ear. "You forget yourself again, and I'll let them forget you." The meaning was clear. From that day on, he buried his anger deeper. Rage became something he fed inward, the way the dogs fed on meat. Yet endurance is not emptiness. Even in silence, memory grows. He remembered every insult, every lash, every night he went hungry so the hounds would eat. He remembered the way overseers laughed as they tested the dog's aggression, the way fear was treated like entertainment. Those memories did not fade. They settled, layered one atop another, forming something heavy and patient. His obedience made him invisible. Overseers stopped watching him closely. They trusted him because he never challenged them. That trust was accidental, careless, and dangerous. It gave him freedom within the narrow boundaries of his role. He was allowed to move at night, allowed to handle food supplies, allowed to make decisions about portions and timing, all because he had proven, year after year, that he would never step out of line. But obedience forced for too long does not erase thought. It sharpens it. He watched the patterns of cruelty the same way he watched the dogs. He saw how punishment escalated, how fear was maintained, how hunger was used to control both man and animal. He saw how those in power grew careless, believing their dominance permanent. That carelessness was the first crack. The hounds sensed the change in him long before anyone else did. Not a rebellion, not yet, but a stillness, a focus. When he moved among them, there was a calm that hadn't been there before. His voice grew quieter, more deliberate. His hands steadier. The dogs responded, watching him closely, as if waiting for something they could not name. Years of unseen cruelty do not disappear. They ferment. They settle into resolve. By the time anyone noticed a difference, it was too late to trace where it began. They thought he was broken. They thought silence meant surrender. They never understood that silence had given him time to observe, to remember, to learn exactly how hunger and obedience could be reversed. Because the most dangerous thing a system built on cruelty can create is not rebellion born of rage, but patience born of suffering. And he had spent his entire life learning how to wait. The night it happened began like every other. The sun fell behind the trees, the heat clung to the air, and the kennels filled with restless movement as the hounds sensed feeding time approaching. He carried the buckets as he always did, their weight familiar, the path worn into muscle memory. No one watched him closely anymore. Years of obedience had turned him into part of the landscape, reliable, silent, harmless. That was the mistake. Something had shifted earlier that day. Not suddenly, not loudly, but enough for him to feel it in his chest. Another punishment had been carried out near the kennels. Another body dragged past the cages. Another reminder that nothing would ever change if everything stayed the same. As night fell, the barking sounded different to him, sharper, more impatient. Hunger was already alive in them. Routine mattered. He had followed it for decades. The same order, the same portions, the same careful balance that kept the hounds fierce but controllable. But that night, routine became choice. He stood before the cages longer than usual. Listening, watching. The dogs pressed forward, teeth flashing in the dim light, their bodies coiled tight. They trusted him. That trust was absolute. He began the feeding slowly, deliberately. One bucket down, then another. But something was missing. The smell was wrong. The portions were lighter. Not enough to raise alarm at first, just enough to sharpen edges. The dogs ate fast, scraping the bowls clean, licking metal, growling low. Hunger wasn't satisfied. It was awakened. Then he did something he had never done before. He did not refill the bowls. Instead, he waited. Minutes stretched. The dogs paced, snarled, snapped at one another. Chains rattled. Normally, this was when he would step in, calm them, restore order. That was what he had been trained to do. That was what kept everyone safe. But he stayed where he was, watching as the balance he had maintained for years began to tilt. And then came the second change, the one no one could undo. He moved to the storage shed where the extra feed was kept, the place only he was trusted to access. But he didn't bring back meat. He brought back something else. Something wrapped, something heavy. The scent hit the hounds instantly. Their bodies went still, noses lifting, eyes locked on him. This was not routine food. This was different. This was wrong. He placed it down and stepped back. The dogs howled, not in excitement, but in confusion, in raw instinct. Hunger overrode training. Years of conditioning cracked open under the pressure of need. Chains strained, teeth snapped. One of the weaker hounds cried out as the others turned on it, drawn by scent and desperation. That was the moment the hunger changed. He did not intervene. He did not speak. He did not raise his voice. For the first time in his life, he allowed the hounds to follow their nature instead of commands. The sounds that followed were chaotic, metal tearing, bodies colliding, snarls turning into screams that were no longer animal. By the time the noise drew attention from the house, it was already too late. What had been carefully trained could not be untrained. What had been controlled by routine had been released by hunger. When the overseer arrived, lantern shaking in his hand, he stopped short. The kennels were no longer cages. They were broken, bent outward. The ground was torn apart, soaked dark. The hounds stood among the wreckage, breathing hard, their eyes wild and unfocused. They did not respond to shouts. They did not recognize authority. Hunger had erased hierarchy. And the man who had fed them all those years was nowhere in sight. Later, when survivors tried to piece together what had happened, they would say the feeding went wrong, that it was an accident. That something startled the dogs. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Nothing went wrong. For the first time, feeding was no longer about control. It was about release. He had not starved the hounds by neglect. He had starved them with intention, just enough, just long enough to let instinct rise above obedience. He had changed their hunger, and once hunger changes, Nothing that depends on it ever stays the same again. What followed did not end with that night. Hunger, once redirected, does not simply disappear, it learns. In the days after, the plantation tried to return to order, but something essential had fractured. The kennels were repaired, chains replaced, new hounds brought in to fill the empty spaces. Overseers spoke in clipped tones, avoiding detail, insisting the incident was an unfortunate mishap. But fear does not listen to explanations. It remembers sensations, and everyone felt it. The new dogs never behaved like the old ones. They were restless, harder to settle, quicker to bare teeth. Trainers blamed bad stock, bad bloodlines, poor discipline. But the truth was quieter and more disturbing. The old hounds had learned something that night, and animals teach without words. The scent of panic lingered in the soil. The memory of unrestrained hunger lived in the air. Even the fresh dogs sensed it when they were brought near the kennels, hesitating where others once lunged eagerly. People began to notice patterns they couldn't explain. The dogs refused to chase when certain commands were given. At other times, they reacted without orders at all, barking violently at empty paths, straining toward the woods, as if something unseen had passed through. Men argued over whether the hounds were sick or cursed. No one wanted to admit they were changed. Stories spread beyond the plantation. Travelers spoke of a place where even trained hounds had turned unpredictable, where night sounds carried farther than they should. Enslaved people whispered that the dogs remembered who had fed them, who had spoken softly in the dark, who had never used the whip. Some said the hounds were no longer tools, they were witnesses. The most unsettling change was how authority responded. Overseers no longer stood close to the kennels at night. Feeding duties were rotated constantly, as if familiarity itself had become dangerous. No one wanted to become known to the dogs the way he had been known. Trust, once considered useful, was now feared. Yet hunger remained the foundation of control. Despite everything, they could not abandon it. The system depended on it too deeply. And that was the quiet irony. The same method that had built power was the one that now carried doubt inside it. Every measured portion, every withheld meal, carried the memory of what hunger had already done once. Some nights, when the wind shifted just right, the hounds would begin to howl together, not sharply, not wildly, but low and sustained, as if calling to something that never answered. Men woke from sleep unsettled, hearts racing without knowing why. They said it was just animals reacting to the weather. But even storms do not howl with memory. Years passed. New generations arrived who had not witnessed the night, who only knew fragments and warnings. But the rules stayed altered. No one ever again allowed a single man full control over feeding and training. No one allowed routine to settle too deeply. Control became scattered, diluted, cautious. Fear had entered the system, not fear of the hounds, but fear of understanding them too well. And somewhere in that shift lived his final act of defiance. He had not escaped in the way stories usually imagine. He had not run or vanished into legend. What he had done was subtler and more enduring. He had broken the illusion that control was permanent. He had shown that obedience built on hunger is never loyalty, it is only waiting. Long after names were forgotten and records faded, the lesson remained. You could train teeth and muscle. You could shape instinct. But if someone truly understood the hunger beneath it all, if they knew when to withhold, when to wait, when to change what was offered, Then power could slip hands without a single blow being struck. The hounds continued to be fed. They continued to be trained. Life on the surface went on, but beneath it ran a quiet awareness, passed down in glances and unspoken rules. Hunger was no longer just a tool. It was a warning. Because the night he changed their hunger, he proved something no one wanted to say aloud. What is trained by cruelty can always be undone by understanding. Time did not erase what happened. It only buried it under routine and silence. Officially, the incident faded into paperwork and half-spoken explanations. Records were altered, dates blurred, details softened until nothing sharp remained. To outsiders, it became just another unfortunate accident in a dangerous system. But within the boundaries of the land, memory survived in behavior rather than words. The people who lived there learned new habits without ever discussing why. Paths near the kennels were avoided after dusk. Voices dropped when dogs barked suddenly, even if the sound came from far away. Children were warned not with stories, but with looks, the kind that told them not to ask questions they weren't ready to understand. Fear became quiet, disciplined, almost polite. Among the enslaved, the story transformed. It was no longer about the hounds alone, or even about violence. It became a lesson passed in fragments, shaped carefully to survive. They spoke about knowing the systems that bound them, about watching closely, about patience. His name was rarely said, but his choice was remembered. Not as an act of rage, but of precision. They remembered that he did not strike back blindly. He did not scream. He did not rush. He waited. That detail mattered. In a world where survival often depended on reacting quickly, his power came from restraint, from understanding how long hunger could stretch before it broke something open. That understanding became its own kind of inheritance. Even those who benefited from the system sensed the shift. Overseers grew more cautious, less confident in the tools they once relied on without thought. They added layers of control, more men, more rules, more distance, but distance created uncertainty. No one truly understood the hounds anymore. Knowledge had been scattered intentionally, and with it, responsibility. Control weakened as it multiplied. The land itself seemed to remember. Seasons passed, crops grew and failed, buildings aged. But certain places never felt the same. The ground near the kennels stayed uneven, as if refusing to be smoothed completely. Dogs hesitated there, noses low, circling without reason. People noticed, then pretended not to. Years later, when new generations took over, they inherited a system already altered by fear. They knew what to do, but not why. Rules were followed rigidly, without the confidence that once supported them. That rigidity made the structure brittle. Systems that rely on obedience without understanding cannot adapt. They can only repeat, and repetition carries risk. What endured most powerfully was the idea that knowledge itself could be dangerous. Not book knowledge, not law, but intimate understanding. The kind that comes from proximity and attention. He had known the hounds too well. He had listened when others only commanded. That closeness had been dismissed as harmless, even useful. In the end, it was the most threatening thing of all. The lesson settled into the bones of the place. Never assume the quiet man is powerless. Never assume routine means loyalty. Never believe that control built on hunger is stable. These truths were never written down, but they shaped decisions long after the original story blurred into myth. And for those who remembered him most clearly, the legacy was not the violence of that night, but the proof it offered. Proof that even within the tightest systems, there are pressure points. That understanding can become leverage. That patience can become force. He did not leave behind a rebellion or a movement with a name. He left behind doubt. And doubt, once planted inside an unjust system, does not die easily. It waits, in the end. The most unsettling part of the story was not what happened to the Hounds, or even what happened that night, but how the meaning of it refused to stay fixed. Different people carried different versions, shaped by fear, guilt, or hope. For some, it was a warning about losing control. For others, it was proof that control had never truly existed at all. The same event lived multiple lives, depending on who remembered it. Among the enslaved, the story softened at the edges over time, not because it was forgotten, but because it had to survive. Details were blurred intentionally. Names were replaced with descriptions. Places were hinted at rather than identified. What remained clear was the feeling, the understanding that power could be studied, not just endured. That systems had patterns. That even the most terrifying tools had limits, if someone learned them deeply enough. Older people told the story late at night, never straight through, always in pieces. A sentence here, a warning there. Children learned not by being instructed, but by listening. The lesson wasn't about violence. It was about awareness, about watching closely, about knowing when silence mattered more than action. His choice became a symbol, not of destruction, but of agency, rare, fragile, and costly. Those who upheld the system told a different version, when they told it at all. In their telling, the night was chaos without cause, a failure of discipline, an unpredictable outbreak, something that could be prevented with stricter rules and tighter chains. That explanation comforted them, because it preserved the belief that order was natural and permanent. To admit otherwise would mean admitting vulnerability. But their behavior betrayed them. They acted as if the land itself might turn against them. They avoided reliance on any single person. They feared familiarity. They confused distance with safety. In trying to prevent another rupture, they weakened their own foundation. Control became mechanical, joyless, brittle. The system still functioned, but it no longer believed in itself. As years passed, the stories slipped into rumor, then legend. Outsiders heard fragments and embellished them. Some claimed the Hounds were cursed. Others said the man had vanished into the woods and lived among animals. These versions were easier to digest because they turned history into myth. Myths are safer than truths because they don't demand change. Yet the truth persisted in subtler ways. In the way dogs were trained differently afterward. In the way feeding schedules were altered and re-altered. In the way no one ever again allowed trust to grow too deep between handler and animal. The fear was not of another rebellion, but of another understanding. What the story ultimately revealed was something few wanted to face: cruelty depends on predictability. It requires that suffering follow known rules, that fear move in expected directions. The moment someone understands those rules too well, cruelty becomes unstable. It can be redirected. It can be turned inward. It can collapse under its own weight. His legacy was not a single act, but a shift in perception. He showed that even the most controlled environments contain cracks. That knowledge, not strength, is often the most dangerous thing a system can allow to grow unchecked. He didn't break chains with force. He studied the chain until he knew exactly where it would fail. And that understanding did not disappear when he did. Long after the plantation changed hands, long after laws shifted and the world moved on, the story still surfaced in unexpected places. In conversations about control, in warnings passed quietly, in the instinctive unease people felt around systems that relied too heavily on hunger, fear, or silence. The details no longer mattered. The meaning did. Because beneath all the versions, one truth remained steady. Power that feeds on deprivation is always at risk of being rewritten by the very people who understand deprivation best. Hunger teaches lessons no rulebook can contain. And when someone listens closely enough, hunger stops being a weakness. It becomes a language. That was the final inheritance of the night. He changed their hunger, not destruction, but revelation.